And joining us via Zoom from Chicago, where he's been at the Democratic National Convention, Luke Perry from Utica University. And we'll start right there in Chicago. It was a big week for the Democrats, maybe an election-determining week. They brought out the 1-2 punch of the Obamas on Tuesday, Tim Walz and his family on Wednesday. Then last night, Kamala Harris reintroduced herself to the nation, this time as the Democratic nominee for president. I'd like to get the impressions of the panelists, and Luke, we'll start with you since you're there. Did she do enough to keep the momentum going? She's had a lot of momentum lately. Did she do enough?
I think certainly the vice president did. At every point so far that she's been candidate, I think they've risen to the moment and exceeded what other expectations Democrats had. In terms of the speech, to start, it was on time, which has been really the biggest knock of how things have gone at this convention. I think Vice President Harris was a little bit nervous at first when the speech began. There was 5, 6, 7, 8 good evenings and a little giddiness there, but she totally nailed it. The speech was well written. It was well delivered. I think throughout this convention and her on the campaign trail, you see notes of Barack Obama in terms of how she's presented herself, but also you see her unique flavor as well, talking about her professional experience, emphasizing motherhood and family. So the Democratic Party is as unified as I've seen it in recent memory, and they are fully behind Harris moving forward.
Lisa, did she, in your view, successfully sort of recast her image from an ineffective vice president to someone ready to be president?
I mean, I feel like she has been doing that since since President Biden stepped out of the race. So I don't know that the speech was pivotal in that regard. I don't know that it made that much difference. I mean, I think it was a very good speech. But I do think, yes, I think she's sort of almost immediately kind of stepped out of the shadow and has recast herself.
Mm-hmm. Nina.
Yeah, one of the things that she has been criticized for is not offering policy specifics. And I think it's important for us to remember that policy specification exists on a continuum. And so the question is, how specific must she be? So I took the time to go back and look at Roosevelt's acceptance speech. Roosevelt responsible for the largest expansion of government size and also role. And what I found there was in his first acceptance speech, he did not lay out that he was going to pass the Social Security Administration Act of 1935. He didn't say that he was going to implement price controls and the FDIC and so forth. But what he did do was signal that he was going to shift away from his opponent's approach, Herbert Hoover, of not having the government be involved in the market as much. What I'll say also is that when I looked at Trump's acceptance speech, there too, he made these huge promises, just some of them were ridiculous. I am going to end the war between Ukraine and Russia immediately. I'm going to bring down prices immediately and so forth. So I do think that Harris has to do more, but not lay out bills. But she does have to change the focus. I'm going to say this, it may be shocking, away from abortion and more toward the things that people care about, the economy and health care.
And one of the things she did last night, Aaron, she had a more muscular approach, it seemed, in terms of national security than I expected.
Sure. I mean, you had chants of USA, USA, USA echoing through the convention hall, which was honestly something I didn't really expect. I mean, the Democrats are positioning themselves as America's party. It's hard to overstate the amount of joy and excitement and hope, dare I say, relief that was present there in the convention hall. You know, we're on this new way forward, and she sort of clearly laid out that she was going to move forward rather than backward in distinction with Trump. But picking up on Nina's point about specifics, you know, I'm a climate scientist, and I think a lot about climate change, this existential threat that humanity is facing. And we heard that word once last night in her speech in a laundry list of other things she wanted to address. Oh, and the climate crisis too. And I think there's some reasons for that, right? She's being told that if she focuses too much on climate, it might alienate middle class, working class voters who have seen Biden's climate policies and they're not necessarily fully sold on them yet. But I agree with Nina. I think she needs to think about how to pivot beyond just the talking points on reproductive freedom, which is great, but start talking about the economy and particularly healthcare as well. And I'd certainly love to hear more of the specifics of what the way forward on climate is under a Harris administration as well.
She probably was doing that to some extent because of Pennsylvania and her record previously on fracking.
Absolutely.
Anirban.
Yeah, so I found the convention kind of a contradiction of sorts. It was pitch perfect and tone deaf at the same time. How can you be that way? Well, it was pitch perfect because you have Mindy Kaling, John Legend, the Obamas showed up, Oprah Winfrey, you get a car, we get a car, everybody gets a car, right? DJ spinning roll call, all that is very much fun. But, you know, scholars around the world, we are looking at the highest amount of genocide, massacre of children and women in modern history. And that is completely, the Democratic Party was completely silent. To be fair, though, the Democrats had a separate panel where a Palestinian-American doctor called Tanya Haj Hassan, the uncommitted delegates, they had a listening session with hundreds of delegates that joined. There was a huge protest outside the convention center by pro-Palestinian activists. So, you know, yes, freedom, Kamala is listening, Mamala is great, but at the same time, what do you say to the mother of Muhammad Bhar, who was an autistic kid in Palestine, 24-year-old man, who was killed by attack dogs? He never spoke in his life. The last words he said, first time, was, "Khalas Habibi, leave it alone, my dear," right? So it is tone deaf when you talk about so much about freedom and this horrible genocide is going on that the ICJ also condemns. It's tone deaf. It's tone deaf.
All right, I want to get back to Luke in Chicago. Luke, aside from last night's speech from Vice President Harris, what about the feel of the convention the rest of the time? You were on the floor there for most of the time. What did it feel like?
Well, certainly people are excited. I think with the perspective I've had, you see certain themes that kind of bubble to the top, and my colleagues have touched on some of them in fascinating fashion. One thing that struck me is that they're trying to beat the GOP at their own game. As was mentioned, they're really emphasizing freedom, nationalism, and presenting Harris as the change candidate, which is kind of tough to do, but they're pulling it off so far, given that, you know, Donald Trump, former president, is running. They're also making broad appeals to Republican moderates as well as different Democratic factions. I think to try to draw a contrast to Trump, they're really emphasizing character and service more than policy, to the chagrin of some, as we've heard. In terms of abortion, as Nina mentioned, transitioning away from that, they're trying to wrap that into healthcare. So I don't think that what we've seen suggests there are different issues. Certainly the economy hasn't been as mentioned as much, and they're focusing on economic opportunity and a fair deal, kind of reminiscent of Teddy Roosevelt, rather than economic policy specifics. Aaron's absolutely right. Climate change has been largely ignored, which with Aaron being my good friend, I knew would completely upset him. In terms of nationalism and USA signs, they pass those out by the hundreds every day. And last night, they even brought out a huge American flags that they were passing out. So that was remarkable. And to Anirban's point, Gaza has been mentioned periodically, but very carefully, because I think it's political dynamite, particularly before this audience. Harris mentioned it, Biden mentioned it, other people like AOC mentioned it, but certainly not to the satisfactory fashion, I think, for many delegates. And then lastly, I think even though there is all this energy and enthusiasm, they're purposely hedging against complacency. They've presented themselves, the Harris campaign, as the underdog, I think, to try to motivate people to continue to work hard on their behalf.
Yeah, the underdog when it comes to specific election issues that will help to build what Robert Dahl referred to as a lawmaking majority. I'm completely with you that there are certain issues that we as scholars would have liked to see them prioritize, not only climate change, but I would also like to see more talk about civil rights, criminal justice reform. However, I'm also willing to accept that only 6% of the electorate actually cares about those issues and see them as important. And again, this whole thing about, you know, saving democracy, what does that mean? What are they talking about when they refer to democracy? Is it people control, Madisonian democracy, institutional control? That just doesn't resonate. When you ask regular folks, what's important to you? Tell you what they ain't saying democracy.
There is one interesting thing that's also happening, that Act Blue grassroots campaign network that is being hugely activated. They're raising huge amounts of money for Kamala, and this is something that got Biden to power, this grassroots campaigning, and Biden kind of shrugged it towards the end. So it's better that Kamala is kind of reviving that grassroots campaign, lot of different groups, activist groups raising money for Harris.
Okay, we'll be speaking about this campaign pretty much nonstop for the next few months. So